In a previous video, I've discussed the general idea of resurrecting franchises, grand returns of long-thought dead IPs made with the end goal of hopefully rejuvenating the series and making money from a mix of new fans and people nostalgic for the originals. However, not every series makes that move, as some of them instead opt to make their return as guest characters in another franchise, whether it be Banjo and Kazooie appearing in Super Smash Bros. After 11 years of no new games, or JoJo's Bizarre Adventure All-Star Battle including a character from the creator's previous work, Bao. It's for sure an unconventional move, especially when that character wasn't even that popular to begin with, creating for a team-up that leaves people confused as they either don't recognize a crossover is happening, or are left puzzled why they were even brought back in the first place, especially if the game responsible for their return has next to nothing to do with the original IP. So how about I showcase some of the weirdest cases of these types of appearances, with resurrections that even some of the most die-hard fans would look on at in confusion. These are the bizarre guest appearances of forgotten characters. Let's start things off by looking at PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, Sony's attempt at trying to do their own version of Smash Bros, which despite having some interesting ideas, ended up not panning out, mostly due to a mix of a lack of single-player content, gameplay changes that were mostly seen as downgrades when compared to Smash, and the most talked about problem, some of the odd choices as to who made the final roster, both in terms of who didn't make the cut, like Crash, Spyro, or anyone from Final Fantasy, along with some picks like Fat Princess, Evil Cole, and DMC Reboot Dante being confusing at best. However, that's not to say there weren't any good picks. Obviously, you had characters that were big at the time, like God of War's Kratos and Little Big Planet's Sackboy. Tekken's Heihachi Mishima worked as both an homage to the fighting game series most heavily tied to the platform and a showcase of how 3D fighter characters could translate to a platform fighter 9 years before Kazuya was added to Smash. And you even had the odd cool obscure pick like Medieval's Sir Daniel Fortescue. However, the coolest throwback pick isn't any of the game's 24 playable characters, and instead was saved for the single-player mode's end boss, Polygon Man, who despite making his video game debut in All-Stars, is a character with a history that dates all the way back to 1995, as this floating head made up of purple geometric shapes was the first mascot for the original PlayStation, the character being designed by a mix of the ad company Chiat Day and then Sony Computer Entertainment America president Steve Race, being born from a desire to create a more edgy look and tone for the marketing campaign, primarily targeted at 17-year-olds, after an initial negative reaction from test groups towards the PlayStation name. Despite making it onto leaflets given out at the first E3 show that year, the character was quickly shelved after Ken Kutaragi, the global head of the PlayStation brand and widely considered the father of PlayStation, had an overt negative reaction to him, mostly due to a mix of both Sony historically never being interested in the idea of having a singular mascot to represent the brand, instead preferring to utilize the general power of the Sony name, along with the fact he was rendered with flat shading as opposed to the gross shading the actual console used, with future print ads either removing Polygon Man whilst keeping his text boxes, or replaced him with the character Sophia from Battle Arena Toshinden, with the decision to bring him back as the boss of PlayStation All-Stars being based on a mix of how the team wanted the boss to be a representation of fighting the PlayStation brand as a whole, which in turn is also why they didn't go with someone from a pre-existing series, and they also felt that the borderline nonsensical statements from the ads he was in gave them the idea that he was the embodiment of the power and potential of PlayStation. Unfortunately, since All Stars, Polygon Man has mostly disappeared back into obscurity, his only other major appearances since being as a collectible model from the company's now-defunct rewards program, PlayStation Stars, along with him also showing up as a VIP bot you can save in 2024's Astrobot. Though maybe if Sony ever decides to retry the concept of a platform fighter with a PlayStation All-Stars 2, maybe we'll see him again in a proper capacity someday. Assuming they don't just greenlight another remaster of The Last of Us. Moving from one crossover fighter to another, we have SNK's The King of Fighters, the long-running team-based fighter that survived both the company's bankruptcy and a corporate restructure to focus on pachinko. The series featuring a decent mix of original characters and ones pulled from other SNK franchises such as Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Akari Warriors, and Psycho Soldier. Given that nature, there's been the odd surprise inclusion, like the various pachinko characters that appeared in KOF 14 or Bukiri 1's Gai Tendo in KOF 11. But for what I'd argue has been the weirdest inclusion for the series, we need to look at its 3D offshoot with the Maximum Impact sub-series, specifically KOF Maximum Impact Regulation A, a Japan-exclusive upgrade for the second game that released for both arcades and the PlayStation 2 in 2008, with it being notable for featuring the first, and from what I could find, only non-SNK character to be made playable in a KOF game, ignoring the mobile spin-offs. And just who exactly did SNK go with for such an honor? Makoto Mizoguchi from Fighter's History, a game series and character I'm pretty confident saying no one outside of the most die-hard of fighting game fans have ever heard of. To give a quick rundown for anyone not in that camp, Fighter's History is an arcade fighter made in 1993 by Data East, the company often credited for popularizing the one-on-one fighting game with 1984's Karate Champ, it being one of the many games that cropped up in the early 90s trying to capitalize on the success of Capcom's Street Fighter 2, with the only thing that really stands out about the game as super notable being that it was the one that was so blatant with being a Street Fighter 2 ripoff that Capcom decided to pursue legal action to get the game pulled from arcades and store shelves. To make a long story short, whilst the court acknowledged the heavy similarities between the two titles, with the design documents for Fighter's History even making specific mention of Street Fighter 2 multiple times, they ultimately lost the lawsuit as Data East had successfully convinced people that the things Capcom were trying to claim ownership of were not protected by copyright under Sena Fair, a rule that basically prevents concepts that are deemed too generic for anyone to realistically gain ownership of from being copyrighted. In this case, stuff like having a karate practitioner or a fireball super move in a fighting game, with Data East backing up their claim by using their own failed lawsuit against the company Epix as an example, when they tried to sue them for blatantly copying Karate Champ, which they ultimately lost for the same reason. While Fighter's History would receive two sequels, with 1994's Karnov's Revenge, also known as Fighter's History Dynamite, and 1995's Fighter's History Mizoguchi Kiki Ipatsu, or Mizoguchi's Moment of Crisis in English, the series has effectively been completely forgotten outside of that lawsuit, which in an alternate history could have led to Capcom owning the concept of fighting games, raising the question of why after 13 years of no new installments did the main character suddenly show up in another company's crossover? Well, there's two reasons. First was that it was part of a marketing stunt for a Japan-only crossover mobile game featuring characters from Fatal Fury Special and Karnov's Revenge. And the second was that apparently Falcon, a longtime artist for SNK and the guy often credited for being the lead of the Maximum Impact games, apparently just really likes him and considers the character to be one of his favorites from his fighting game days. I guess that just leaves us with one more question. Which SNK game made the stranger pick for guest fighters, between Regulation A getting the lead of a long-dead fighting game series, and City of the Wolves including Ronaldo and a Bosnian-Swedish DJ? Let's return back to the PS1 for a second to talk about a relatively obscure game for the system with 2000's Mort the Chicken, which was published by Crave Entertainment and developed by Now, a very short-lived studio founded by Ed Annunziata, who's mostly known as the creator of Echo the Dolphin, the game seeing you attempt to save a bunch of baby chicks from a race of sentient cubes after they mistake some hay bales on the farm for kidnapped citizens. Despite that outlandish premise, the game was generally regarded as being pretty unremarkable and for the most part was just a fairly bonk standard 3D platformer, getting mostly mixed to negative reviews. It pretty much just being one of those games you'd probably like if you played it as a kid, but otherwise, it's just okay at best. Honestly speaking, there's a very likely chance that this game would have been simply forgotten to the sands of time if it wasn't for the fact that over 2 decades after the original game's release, its titular protagonist made a sudden return in the 2023 indie game Pizza Tower, specifically appearing as a power-up in the game's 7th level, Fun Farm, where Peppino can use him for a double jump, attack enemies, or swing on Mort hooks, with the level even containing a secret collectible called the Mort Cube. As for why he's here, apparently Pizza Tower's main developer, McPig, just felt like including him, and he got permission from Annunziata to do so, with the original plan being to make him the boss of World 2 before later deciding to just make him a power-up, with the confirmation he was going to be in the game being made as far back as February 2019, just under 4 years before the game actually released. That may sound like an underwhelming answer, but realistically this is just how 90% of crossovers end up happening. It's just one guy asking someone else if they can borrow their character, sometimes with extra legal steps. The main thing of interest here just being how unremarkable and random the choice was, especially given if it wasn't for the level's title card specifically pointing it out, most people wouldn't even be able to register it was a crossover. Whether or not it's the weirdest thing in the game is still up to interpretation though. Let's end things off today with what is for me the most confusing thing I've ever seen, in terms of both who was brought back and the game responsible for their return. Let's ease ourselves in by going over the character in question, that being Wild Woody, a platformer character made by Sega that debuted in 1995 on the Sega CD, it both being one of the last titles the company would make for the add-on, along with being the final title of developer Sega Multimedia Studio. The general plot being that a cursed totem pole threatens to destroy the world after the upper totems created parallel worlds from items in an adventurer's office, with the lowest totem then bringing a pencil to life and gives it the power to create living sketches, tasking him with exploring the new worlds created and bringing back the other totem pieces to save the world. Whilst the game's ending teased the possibility of a sequel, even including a fourth wall joke of Woody himself doubting such an idea, no follow-up would ever come due to a mix of both its lack of commercial success and the fact that even on release, most critics thought the game sucked, with it nowadays often being considered one of the worst games on the Sega CD, if not one of the worst platformers of all time, mostly due to a mix of its grainy visuals, poor controls which sometimes makes it impossible to avoid taking damage, and its cutscenes which, for a lack of a better description, have a very shitpost nature to them. The only common points of praise being the concepts of being able to draw or erase items to help you, and the soundtrack. Unsurprisingly, this meant nothing was done with Wild Woody afterwards, Sega not really having the motivation to bring back or utilize a character the majority of people either didn't know about or didn't like, with no one else seemingly having a vested interest in doing so either, until 2024, when Woody was added as a free DLC character for an indie kart racer, the Steam description making it clear that he was added with permission from the original creators of the series and not Sega. The devs even getting his original voice actor, Joseph Kurska, to record new lines. However, the surprising part of the news wasn't so much that Woody had come back after almost 30 years of nothing, but that the indie racing game in question was Shady Lude Kart, a kart racer in which every other character is taken from adult animations and games. If you're not picking up what I'm putting down, Wild Woody's comeback was in a hentai-themed kart racer, complete with unlockable lewd illustrations featuring the character. Obviously no judgment if that's your thing, but you have to admit this has to be one of the weirdest guest character inclusions of all time, and without a doubt the strangest return a dormant IP has made, as really the only connection Woody has to that kind of scene is a secret Easter egg in the original game that allows you to create the mermaid illustration without her top on, which is admittedly more than other characters from the era, but still. I think we'll end things off here for now, but I hope this has showcased that there's nothing stopping a character from making a grand return, with most of the time it usually only taking one passionate fan getting in contact with the original creator to give them a second lease on life. And also, that said second leases on life can end up being in ways you could not possibly fathom.